You can use the grid to more precisely position content in rows and columns. It gives you more control on where your content is than any of the panel controls you've seen. To define a row or a column, you use a row definition element or a column definition element in your XAML. You can type these in XAML. You can also click in the margins of the window and have Visual Studio add the row and column definitions. And then to place an element in a particular cell in the grid, you set its grid.row and grid.column properties. If you want an element to occupy more than one cell, either horizontally or vertically, then you can use the grid.rowspan property. There are three mechanisms you can use for sizing cells in a grid. You can use automatic sizing, and in that case rows and columns will be evenly spaced. And there are two ways you can specify this in your XAML. You can set the height property of the row definition to auto, or you can leave it off, because automatic sizing is the default. You can use absolute sizing, where you specify a particular size. So in this example, we've specified that we want this particular row to be 50 pixels high. And you can use proportional sizing to divide space proportionally. So let's say you have 5 rows and you set the height on each of them to an asterisk, then each row would get 1/5 of the available space. If you had 4 rows, they'd each get 1/4 of the available space. You can fine-tune that by adding a number. Let's say you have 2 rows and you set the first height to star and the second to 2 star. This says that the first row gets 1/3 of the available space and the second row gets twice that, or 2/3 of the available space. So let's go see some examples of using the grid. Here's a simple grid with 3 rows and 2 columns. And notice that I'm not specifying any height for the row definitions or the column definitions, so they will automatically be sized. Each row will be 1/3 of the height of the window, each column will be half the width of the window. And then I filled each cell of the grid with a text block. So this first text block, the text is R0C0, and I put it there by setting grid.row equals 0 and grid.column equals 0. This text block is in the first row, second column, second row, first column, etc. Now the default for grid.row or grid.column is 0, so I don't literally need to specify that, but I find it more helpful if I specify both. And now when I run this, let's go into grid examples. Here's automatic sizing. The columns will always be half the width of the window, and the rows will always be 1/3 of the height of the window regardless of the size. So the space is automatically proportioned evenly. In the second example, I'm using absolute sizing. So I've specified that the first row should be 50 high, the second row should be 150 high, and the third row should be 75 high. These are pixels. And I want the first column to be 50 pixels wide and the second column to be 225 pixels wide. So we go back and run this. Now notice that the first column is 50 pixels wide, but the second column, even though I said it should be 225, will actually be all of the remaining space. And I said that the first row should be 50 high, the second row should be 150 high, the third row should be 75 high, the third row actually gets all of the remaining space. So when you use absolute sizing, the runtime is going to essentially not so much ignore what you ask for the last row and last column, but it'll only be the default. Once you resize, both of those will get what's left. In the third example, I'm using proportional sizing. So the first and third rows have their height set to star, and the second row has its height set to 2 star. So this basically says that the first row should be 1/4 of the height, the third row should be 1/4 of the height, and the second row should be 2/4 or half of the height. The first column has its width set to star, the second column has its width set to 4 star, so the first column will be 1/5 the width of the window, and the second column will be the remaining 4/5 of the width. And again, that's proportional, so regardless of the size, the first column is 20% of it, and the second column is 80%. The first row is a quarter, the third row is a quarter, and the second row gets half of the height. Now you can combine these sizing mechanisms. So here I've said that the first and third row of the grid should be 50 pixels high, and the second row should be all of the remainder. And the first column should be 100 pixels wide, the second column should get the remainder. So regardless of the height of the window, the first and third row are 50 pixels high, and the second row gets what's left. And regardless of the width of the window, the first column is 100 pixels wide, and the second column gets what's left. In the fifth example, I'm doing a little report in a grid here, and I want to span columns. So let me call this up so we can see the actual grid lines. All of the columns and rows are evenly spaced. My first text block is annual sales by region. I put it in grid row column 0, but then I span 4 columns. So it actually spans the entire width of the grid. I've got it horizontally aligned in the center and vertically aligned in the center, so this text will be in the center of this row. This text block for East, I've got in row 2, column 0, but it's spanning 2 rows, so it spans vertically across rows 2 and 3. And then sales unavailable is in the bottom row, spanning these 2 columns. And because I'm using absolute sizing, regardless of the size of the window, the cells are all evenly sized, and the title stays in the center, and East and sales unavailable span their 2 rows. And in the final example, I'm using a grid to lay out a data entry form. I'm going to look at this first in design view because I want to see the grid lines. So I've got the name text block and the text box in the first row, email, text block and text box in the second row, etc. This contact info text block, which is right here, is actually in row 0, column 0, but it spans 2 rows, so I wanted it centered vertically in between name and email. Then name and email, etc. are text blocks that have their horizontal alignment set to right, so they would butt up against the right-hand side of the column. And then the text boxes are in the third column. Now the buttons, clear and submit, are in a stack panel with orientation horizontal, and they're in this last column. Grid row 4, column 2. So now when I run this, because clear and submit are in the last row and last column, they will always stay in the lower right of the form. Now because I'm using grids with automatic sizing, the distance between the text boxes will increase or decrease as I change the size of the form. So whether in this example you use a grid or a dock panel kind of depends on how important it is to control the spacing between the 2 text boxes.